Thank you, and to you as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm Janine Donnelly, Manager of Webinars for Tech Channel, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. You may ask a question at any time during the event by entering it into the Q&A panel. If you experience technical difficulties during the webinar, please alert us using the Q&A panel and someone will assist you. You may download a PDF version of today's slide deck by clicking on the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources. You'll find that on the left side of your screen. And know that you can download those right from the platform without being disconnected from the webinar. Today's webinar, Move It or View It, How to Meet Demand for VSAM, ISM, Db2 data, and more, is sponsored by Software AG and Bloor Research. Our featured speakers today are Daniel Howard and Harpal Gill. Daniel is a senior researcher at Bloor Research, focused on DevOps and information management. He brings technical expertise, insight, and the on-the-ground experience as a former Agile developer and tester at IPL. Harpal is responsible for marketing strategy, worldwide sales and alliances for Software AG's data integration solution, Connects. With more than 20 years of experience in the data integration and business intelligence space, Harpal understands the value of data and what it can do for business. And with that, Daniel, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Hi, everyone. This is Daniel Howard, and thank you for the introduction, Janine. As she mentioned, I'm a senior analyst at Bloor Research, and today I'm here to talk to you about modern trends within the data movement space, and in particular, the data virtualization subspace. And I'm going to explain exactly what data virtualization is, but we'll get to that in a bit. So now, let me go over the agenda I've got for you today. First of all, I'm going to, as mentioned, talk through some of the more prevalent market trends that we at Bloor Research are seeing within the data movement space. We're going to move on to talk to you a bit about what data virtualization is, what its advantages are, and why and when you might want to use it instead of traditional data movement methods. Finally, I'm going to highlight another trend we're seeing within the space, which is the need to deploy data movement and data virtualization processes quickly and without disrupting ongoing processes and operations in order to capitalize on time-sensitive use cases. And finally, I'm going to summarize what I've told you at the end before I hand you over to Harpal for his half of the presentation. So without further ado, let's begin. So I'm going to start off by, as mentioned, by telling you about a few of the market trends we're seeing within the data movement space. And the first of these is, in a word, the cloud. And this is by no means, of course, restricted to data movement. In fact, it's touching virtually every aspect of data management. But data movement is certainly not exempt. And in particular, it's particularly important for data movement because of the increasing popularity of cloud migrations, which is to say, migrating on-premise deployments to either entirely cloud deployments or to hybrid on-premise cloud deployments. Obviously, in order to set up doing one of those migrations, you'll need to move data, hence data movement. Mainframe modernization also plays a part here. A lot of companies, even a lot of companies which want to do cloud migrations will still be maintaining mainframes. And either they're going to need to get the data out of that mainframe in order to put it in the cloud, or they're going to need some way of modernizing that mainframe and integrating with the cloud. So that's a part of this too. Before I move on, I would also like to mention a bit about hybrid deployments. We see hybrid deployments being both significantly more popular than purely cloud deployments and significantly more practical as well. Cloud certainly has its advantages, but we don't think it's suitable for every use case, and we don't think it's suitable for necessarily suitable for all of your data either. So yeah, hybrid deployments are, we think very practical and increasingly common. Moving on to our second trend, this is another trend which is very prevalent within data management in general, and certainly within data movement, and that's the increased need for compliance, security, and governance in the wake of recent regulations, including but not limited to GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and the LGPD, which is the equivalent. I won't try to pronounce the full name, but is the equivalent in Brazil. There's also, I believe, a new law recent law in New Zealand, and more upcoming regulation around the world to enforce this on an international scale. So as you might imagine, it's particularly, and even more important than it used to be, to make sure that your data movement processes are secure and that they abide by all these different compliance mandates that might be acting on them. And again, this is true throughout data, but for data movement in particular, because moving data is inherently a risk from a security perspective, you need to make sure you're paying attention to this stuff and keeping on top of it. You might want to, to ensure that when you move data, it's being protected in transit. This will also play into why data virtualization might be appealing as well, which we'll get onto in a moment. So our third trend, which is now more specific to data movement, is data virtualization itself. It's been around, at least in principle, for quite a while, but we're now seeing it become more popular, both among vendors and among consumers. And the basic idea of data virtualization, as you can perhaps see from the diagram is up on the deck in front of you, is creating a virtual querying layer that sits on top of all of your disparate data sources and lets you query all of them at once from a single location and using a single interface. And this stands in contrast to maybe more traditional sort of data warehousing approach, where you would take all of the, think about all the, figure out which data you wanted to query, collect all of it from a bunch of different data sources and move it into a single analytics environment, then query that environment. And again, we're going to talk about this more in detail in a bit, so I'm not going to belabor the point here too much. Although I will note as well, if you're not familiar with the term data virtualization, you may be familiar with the term query federation, which is an equivalent technology. And finally, for our trends, we have no-code and self-service. This is the idea that, this is rather couched in the idea that the sort of traditional model for developing data movement and data virtualization pipelines, where a business user finds an analytics use case, needs a pipeline built, so they go off to IT and ask them for it, and they get back to them in days or weeks, sometimes maybe even months, with some sort of solution, some sort of built pipeline, and they can then go off and do that use case. Well, we see this methodology as no longer being fit for purpose, and I think the market does as well. So self-service, the idea that business users can simply build it themselves, is increasingly popular and increasingly prominent. And then no-code technology and low-code technology, the subsidiary of that, are then often being used in order to enable this self-service. So you can see on the slide here, we have a picture of Software AG Connex's query builder, which you can see is nice and visual and friendly. So this is a good example of such a no-code solution. So I promised I'd talk to you a bit more in detail about data virtualization, and that's what I'm going to do now. And first of all, I thought it would be best to establish what exactly data virtualization is, and to do that, I want to establish exactly what data movement is, so that we can contrast the two. So, apologies if some of this is old news to you, but just to set a baseline, data movement, what we mean when we say data movement, is when you're physically taking your data from one location or one environment and putting it somewhere else. You're moving it. It's fairly self-explanatory. And the idea here is that maybe you want to migrate your data so you can get it into the cloud. Maybe you want to centralize it so that you can analyze it, centralize data from multiple different data sources so that you can analyze it, what have you. And this is usually going to involve data integration processes, which will often encompass, or might encompass, I should say, ETL, so extract, transform, and load, but could equally involve ELT, extract, load, and transform, or even ETLT, extract, load, transform, load. I won't get into the major differences there, but it's a matter of where you decide to do the transformation, which is normally a matter of performance, but again, I won't get into it now. But then it can also encompass CDC, so change data capture, as well as database replication. Data virtualization, in contrast, doesn't move your data. It leaves it where it is and in the format that it's already in. What it does do is create a single virtual queryable view that sits above all of your data sources, as in the diagram I showed you a few slides ago, and allows you to query all of your data sources simultaneously and create data sets consisting of elements picking and choosing from each data source via a single point of access. And in contrast to data movement, obviously it doesn't require moving your data, and therefore it doesn't require any data integration, ETL, ELT, etc. So I've explained what data virtualization is, but it's unquestionable that data movement, data integration are more mature technologies. They're more widely known technologies and widely understood, and they certainly have more inertia in the space. So why should you or anyone care about data virtualization? Well, I'll tell you. To begin with, data virtualization reduces the need to duplicate data, because you don't need to, when you create an analytics environment, for example, you're going to be picking and choosing a bunch of these data across different sources to create your data set. And that means duplicating it into your new analytics environment. And now you've got multiple sources of the same data, which first of all takes up more space, which increases storage costs. But it also means you're going to need to continually synchronize the data in your new analytics environment with the original data that it was duplicated from, in order to make sure you don't get out of sync and everything stays up to date. This can incur quite a lot of maintenance costs, which data virtualization essentially eliminates. Data virtualization also has performance benefits. Because you're leaving data, you can simply leave data in the data environment in which it is most performant, and in the format that it is most performant. You don't need to take data and force it into a particular space or particular format in order to centralize it, in a sense. You also get flexibility because you have a compute layer as a separate virtual querying layer. You can scale compute as much as you want without needing to expand your storage capabilities. So it separates compute from storage, in other words, which is a significant boon. As mentioned, as I've already mentioned, this data virtualization lets you leave data where it already is, and in the format that it's best suited for. So, for example, it also lets you query across different data types. So, for example, maybe you want to make a query which involves document data and relational data. And in a sort of data warehousing analytics model, you would need to force one into the other's format effectively, or create some sort of some tertiary format which they can both live in. And with data virtualization, that's just not an issue. You can simply query multiple data types at once. There are also security benefits to data virtualization, because of course you're not moving data, which, as I mentioned before, is an inherent risk. You're just eliminating a risk. You also, rather than having a grip of analytics warehouses that a number of people might want to access, you have a single point of access, which means you've only got a single location to secure instead of many locations. And finally, sometimes there's going to be data which you just can't move. I've certainly talked to a significant number of organizations which have very highly sensitive, business critical data which is simply too sensitive and too volatile to be moved, period. Often, mainframe data which has been sitting there for who knows how long. And data virtualization means you can still query it. You can still analyze it and get at it in a way which makes sense, where data movement simply isn't an option. But having said all that, it's not all sunshine and roses for data virtualization. It does have some limitations. First of all, is that I mentioned that it's generally more secure. Well, yes, it is, but at the same time, there are other governance and compliance implications because you're working with a new model rather than the old one, which may cause some trouble and is worth bearing in mind. There's also the fact that because you've got data in multiple locations, you might have to deal with network lag, which can cause a performance decrease. Now, this means that in theory, having your data in one place should be more performant. In practice, we usually find this is not the case. The deleterious effect of network lag is outweighed by being able to have all of your data stored in whichever location or format is most performant for querying it. But again, it's worth bearing in mind. There's also the fact that sometimes it makes sense from an analytics perspective to leverage data that to transform your data or to put it into a dedicated analytics environment. So maybe you've got some data which is maybe in relational format or document format, but is much easier to query in columnar format. Well, in a data movement model, you couldn't just do that as part of the ETL process, but data virtualization can't really cope with it. Of course, you could just use the two at once, which I'll get to in a moment. And perhaps most of all is that, yes, data virtualization is very good for analytics and analytics-related use cases. But fundamentally, it will not work for, say, migration. The end of migration is moving your data, and data virtualization won't satisfy that end. That said, it can be important as part of migrations, for example, to analyze the structure of your data before creating integration processes, but it's never going to form the core of those solutions. So I know that was a lot to take in, particularly if data virtualization is new to you, so I thought I'd just sum it up here. On the one hand, we have data movement, which is, in theory, greater performance because it doesn't have to deal with network lag. It can handily leverage multiple data formats, multiple data environments, not necessarily simultaneously, but quite happily you can transform data to whatever format you want to query it, if you have a particular reason to do that. And more to the point, it provides access to any of the use cases in the space, not analytics and related. And then in contrast, data virtualization, although it does have to deal with network lag, normally has greater performance in practice. It's on the whole more secure because of its single entry point and entire lack of moving data. It will often reduce storage costs due to reducing duplication. It provides versatility in compute and storage thanks to separation. It lets you query disparate types of data at once, even if it can't transform that data in and of itself. And all in all, provides very significant benefits for analytics use cases in particular. So, having said all that, the upshot is that we recommend, ultimately, for most organizations, we recommend both. Similar to when we talked about hybrid deployments at the beginning of this webinar, we don't really see any reason you should restrict yourself. Data movement, there are certainly use cases where data movement will be an essential part of it, and there's no way of getting rid of it. At the same time, data virtualization provides some really significant benefits for the use cases where it's applicable. We think it's certainly worth investing in. So, finally, onto the second major trend I want to talk about, in somewhat less detail this time, which is what we're calling deployment without disruption. I mentioned before, when we talked through market trends, about the importance and popularity of self-service and of no-code development. this is where that comes back into play. It's increasingly common now that business users need to move or virtualize data quickly and without disrupting ongoing operations in order to take advantage of very short windows of opportunity or narrow windows of opportunity. So, for example, very time-sensitive analytics and decisioning based on analytics. And again, this is going back to that self-service piece. You need results back in a matter of days or even hours. You can't afford to wait weeks for IT to get your request, process it, and then deliver it back to you. Because by the time they've done that, it won't matter anymore. So deployment without disruption is a genuine need within the space, we think. And the solution, the ability to provide it, comes from no code, it comes from self-service applied to your data movement and data virtualization processes. And this normally, self-service is essential because of what we just talked about. There's a need to move away from that old model where you rely on IT to do everything for you. No code is a means to an end of enabling self-service, because by taking the code out, usually making some sort of, drag and drop flowchart model or something similar, you allow business users and you empower them to do this stuff themselves without getting bogged down in detail and without exposing too much of your system to people who are not experts in using it, in the technical side of things, which can pose security risks. So to conclude, these are I've got 3 points, major points I've made, which I'd like you to take away from this, if you take away anything. First of all, data virtualization is absolutely gaining traction alongside data movement, and we don't see it going away anytime soon. Both data movement and virtualization have their place in most, if not all, organizations, and you will often benefit from using both. And finally, there is a growing and substantial need to move or virtualize data quickly in order to enable you to address time-sensitive use cases, such as very short time window analytics. And this makes no-code and self-service must-have features. And that's all I've got to say, other than thank you all very much for listening to me, and take it away, Harpal.
Thanks a lot, Daniel, and appreciate that introduction. That was phenomenal. And at this point, I'm going to transition. My name is Harpal Gill, as Janine mentioned. I'm a VP in the Connects group at Software AG, and I'm going to start off with some case studies or use cases which share some of the scenarios that Daniel talked about earlier. So I'm going to start first with a use case scenario which is purely data access. So this is an organization that is a large hotelier, and they actually have a vacation properties group that was running their business on a mainframe, and they have a VSAM application that runs a lot of their business. In fact, they're a very long-term customer of the Connects product, over 20 years with us. And their challenge was they wanted the ability to try and reach more customers, initially via the web, then via mobile devices, and really just trying to compete with startups and also give their customers a better customer experience. The solution was to leverage the Connects SQL access, so Connects for VSAM, and create a mainframe booking application to feed both a web browser initially, and again, now a web browser and a mobile device or mobile app on a mobile device. The impact or the result was now users can leverage their portal via the web, mobile device to see what properties are available, during what date ranges, book these reservations that they may want, check in online, and ultimately it drove higher revenue or new revenue streams for the organization and a much better customer experience, all while being able to leverage the existing mainframe technology and scale and support new what we call digitization in the marketplace. My next scenario or next use case is a large bank that had both a bank and insurance business, or banking and insurance business. And they were actually looking to divest their insurance business from their organization. In the process, this would require a data migration, if you will, or first a splitting of the data, and then a data migration where they would send off some of their data to the new organization that's acquiring their insurance business. Originally, they brought in some SIs. They took a look at the various different data sources and applications that were in there. To give you some idea, they had over 40 different applications, most of them on the mainframe with a few Linux and Unix and Windows environments, but the majority of that 40 plus were being driven from the mainframe. The challenge was they had both structured and unstructured, relational, non-relational data stores. And what they wanted to do was they actually wanted to, Daniel actually mentioned this in his presentation, they wanted to virtualize first to understand and do some planning and analysis of what data they have and how they were going to parse the data. Then the next step was to use a data movement solution and take that data and do ETL in the process of extracting it from these source systems, transforming it slightly, and depositing it into a SQL data warehouse in this particular instance, and two data warehouses specifically, one for the bank that would reside with the bank, and then one that would be ultimately sold off with their insurance business. Ultimately, the result was the project was very successful. They not only had a great experience with both the Connect's data access and data virtualization, and then the data movement technologies, that they not only used it for this project, but then they decided to license it for further projects within their organization as they look towards cloud as a hybrid environment and future uses of the product with data warehouses and data lakes in mind. The next scenario is a pure data virtualization use case. And this is another large bank, global bank, and they have a wealth management division. Within this group, their advisors lacked 24/7 access to the data for their high-value customers. Traditionally, as most data warehouses are, they were populating their data warehouse with data from their mainframe and some other applications into a large data warehouse once, maybe twice a day. And the challenge with that, or the challenge that presented itself, was they had this data warehouse that was populated late at night, and the advisors would come in the morning. And if a customer was to do a transaction, a high-value customer was to transact a $10 million stock sale, for instance, they wouldn't be able to see that until the next day when that next batch job was run. So what they needed was truly a data virtualization solution that virtualized across their core systems, including their data warehouse, because the data warehouse had a collection of all the customers' basic understanding, who they are, what assets they have, things like that, their credentials that aren't changing on a regular basis. And then the applications would have the transactions as they're happening. So in this particular instance, we implemented a Connect's data virtualization solution across their mainframe, AS400, Sybase, Oracle applications. And now the advisor, when a customer rings them up, can go into their solution, their virtualized solution, and see immediately what's happening, where the transaction is in its process, and as it's progressing through, they can give them updates instantly as it's happening. It led to much higher customer satisfaction, and the advisors were able to offer more value to their high wealth customers and all other institutions that they also had as well. I've got one more case study I'd like to share, and then I'll talk a little bit about the product. So the next solution also is a data virtualization, and again, a real-time data virtualization. And what's happening in this particular instance is this is a large biotech, global biotech, organization that has a lot of high-value assets that they're both creating and securing for their development of their various different products. So the challenge was they populated their ERP information and their various applications, their security systems, their HR, all their different credential systems into a data warehouse once a day again. And the challenge was they employ a number of contractors. And should they have a contractor that the contract was to end at 8 a.m. in the morning today, for instance, that actually wouldn't be reflected into the batch upload or into the data warehouse until tomorrow morning or late tonight. And so they needed a solution which would validate, is this contractor still a valid contractor? Do they have access to the labs? Do they have access to the systems? Can they log on? And all that has to happen in sub-second response rates. If you can imagine, I'm a contractor, I'm going to work, I swipe my badge on a key card pass. I want to be able to have that door open within a millisecond or a few milliseconds versus waiting minutes. So in this particular case, they used a data virtualization solution, and they were able to virtualize their HR, their ERP systems, their security systems, and their contracting systems to make sure that is this individual a current and valid individual and have access, and return that in a sub-second response to both when they're logging into their applications via a terminal, mobile device, a laptop, or whether they're trying to use their key card for entry into a secure facility. So let me change gears a little bit and talk about what Connex brings to the table. In fact, the Connex product suite is made up of a couple of different components, and I'll walk you through these in a moment here. But basically, at the highest level, we offer data access, data virtualization, and data movement. So when I talk about data access, we saw earlier in that first case study with the hotelier, with the vacation property, they just wanted pure data access from an application. So Connex offers real-time data access with something called our database adapter. And this real-time access supports standard connectivity mechanisms, things like ODBC, JDBC, OLADB, and .NET, and allows multiple devices, whether it be a desktop, a cloud, or a mobile app, to connect to a data source on a back end on a mainframe, or in fact, we support over 150 different databases on a variety of different platforms. Let's take that a step further. We're talking about data access for an application. What if I just want to use data access for, I've got the latest and greatest BI tool. Perhaps I've moved to Power BI, or I'm using Looker, or I just want to use Excel. Well, the same database adapter will give those tools data access to any relational, non-relational, legacy, modern, cloud, columnar, whatever database you may have. In fact, we support over 150 different databases on a variety of platforms, and those BI or visualization tools typically will want to consume an ODBC or JDBC connection, which we provide. Now I'll build on that a little bit, and I'll talk about data virtualization. Actually, before I do, just let me point out the data access is real-time read and write access. So for the masses, it's just going to be real-time read access. There are going to be some instances where you have people that have the right credentials or right use cases where they need to write back to the data source from another application. And we do provide that as well. Again, we authenticate via the security systems on the application server, so on the database server, and we can layer an additional layer of security on top of that. Now let's transition and talk about data virtualization. As Daniel mentioned, data virtualization is the concept of virtualizing multiple data sources into a single view, whether you want to consume that data via a dashboard or reporting tool or BI or some reason to consume multiple data sources. What Connex does is we take our database adapters and we can assign them to, you can acquire them for any of the 150 plus data sources and virtualize these sources. So one could be, let's, as an example, say I have a file system on the mainframe with VSAM. I have a relational database on in-house like Oracle, and maybe I have a columnar database in the cloud. So I've got 3 different platforms, 3 different types of data sources, one a file, one a relational, and one a columnar. I can go ahead and virtualize those into a single view and provide access to that as if the consumer was accessing a single relational data store. So they think they're just writing their SQL query against a single relational database. And what we're doing is we're taking that query, we're parsing it, we're sending the part to the mainframe, to the Oracle, and to the cloud, and returning the result set in sub-second response time. And we do that all via our data, a single metadata model or a data virtualization layer. And then on the data movement side, we have our data sync product. And the data sync product provides full data movement from extract and load to ETL or ELT. So perhaps you want to do extract, transform, and load, or maybe you want to extract, load, and then transform the data, as we're seeing more and more in the cloud scenarios. And we also offer change data capture or incremental loads. So you're not always moving all the data, but you're moving the changes as they happen, as CDC implies. We support, again, on the source side, over 150 different databases and platforms, and we can move that to any of those 150 plus targets, whether they be an on-premise solution, a cloud solution, or perhaps you're going to a hybrid solution, some on-premise and some on cloud, and we support all flavors as you may want. I'd also like to point out our friends at Bloor Research have what they term a pure play data integration report that they do on a regular cadence. And they actually just recently published a new report where they ranked Software AG Connects as a champion. So if you look at the bullseye chart here, you'll see in the champion category, the underlying Software AG Connects, and our dot is closest to the target in the center. The reasons they picked Software AG Connects as a champion was 3 main reasons. One, we have the broadest set of support for data sources. Again, when I mention 150 different data sources, I should point out these are 150 plus unique data sources. So I'm not counting SQL Server 2000 and 2005 and 2008, 2008 R2. I count all of those as just one. So we truly support over 150 different unique data sources on a variety of platforms. The second point that they mention in their report is we're actually one of the fastest ways to get to the cloud. So Connects will enable you to get to the cloud or your data movement to wherever it needs to be in the fastest possible way. And finally, it was low TCO. So instead of taking days and weeks to install and map and do a data movement, Connects Data Sync will get you up and running within hours. To give you some perspective, if you have a mainframe data source, let's say VSAM on the mainframe, and you're moving to the cloud, it'll take us under a couple of hours to connect to that data source and create our metadata, and then within a couple hours more, we'll be moving the data and have it fully mapped to a repository in the cloud. So within about 4 hours, we've connected, assembled all the metadata, and moving the data to the cloud. So I'd like to wrap up with a little bit of a summary. The Connects Data Integration Suite is a single solution that'll help you unlock your data value without disrupting the business continuity. As Daniel pointed out very well, it's not a matter of do we do data access or data virtualization or data movement. They all have their purpose at the right point in time. As you saw in the case studies, we had solutions where data movement made sense. We had solutions where they needed data access or where they needed data virtualization, or even the migration where they needed to analyze the data first with a data virtualization and then move the data. And that's where Connects comes in. Again, Connects offers you a data access solution to over 150 different data sources on a variety of platforms, data virtualization to any of those 150 plus data sources and platforms, and data movement from any of those 150 plus data sources and platforms. Actually, on the bottom of the picture here, you can see some of the different platforms we support. So we've been talking about the mainframe mainly, but we do, for completeness, I'd like to add, we do support OpenVMS, AS400, Linux, Unix, Windows, cloud, some applications, so a variety of different ways. And your targets for your data movement can be on-premise, in the cloud, or a hybrid. And we support ETL, ELT, change data capture, a very powerful solution all in one. I'd like to end at this point with how we can share more information or how you can find out more about Software AG. So my understanding is you should be able to click on all of these links and have access to the latest Bloor report, discover some information around data virtualization. If you want to see the different adapters we support, you can click there. On the bullet number 4, you can request a demo. And again, if you should want to visit us, we try to make the URL or link very simple. Just think of softwareag.com/connects. So that's really all I have to share today. I want to thank you all for your time. I'm going to turn it back to Janine.
Thanks, Harpal, and you are correct. So if our attendees want to click on any of these links, it will open in a separate window for you, so it's available to you following the webinar. And Harpal, we do have a number of questions, so let's get started. The first question is, for data virtualization, is it also available for IDMS?
Great question. So yes, we support over 150 different data sources. So to your point, we support the mainframe, and IDMS is definitely one of the data sources we support.
Great. Does data virtualization handle record level sharing on VSAMs?
Record level sharing. Yes. So the way we set up our metadata allows you to define the structure, and then yes, we will be able to do it at a record level. And we'd actually love to drill into that a little bit more. There's a couple of different ways, but we'd definitely be happy to chat and show that in a demo.
Great. I have yet another question on data virtualization. You may have covered it after it came in, but it says, do you support connections to the mainframe, Unix, and cloud in one virtualization?
Great question. So yes, we do. As I actually did in my scenario or my example, we can support any of the 150 plus data sources in any combination. So yes, if you in your question you asked mainframe, Unix, and cloud, no problem at all. It can be 2, 3, 5, as many data sources as you wish to virtualize of any of the 150 plus data sources and platforms.
Great. I have one here for Daniel. Okay, it says you described analytics as a use case for data virtualization. Are there others?
Okay, so the short answer is yes. The long answer is that although analytics is probably the most, I mentioned that there are related use cases as well. Analytics is probably the most major use case. Certainly the one we're seeing the most. But as I say, there are certainly others. The other one which springs to mind is using using data virtualization to empower a knowledge graph. In that case, it's important because your effective, knowledge graph thrive on the ability to contain all of the data in your organization. If data lives outside the knowledge graph, then it can be almost invisible. And therefore, relying on data movement can be problematic because you can end up losing information as you move it. And you have to do quite expensive maintenance processes and so on to make sure that isn't happening. Or you could just use data virtualization, which is generally much cheaper and more effective.
Gotcha. Okay, I have a question about data movement, Harpal. You mentioned multiple databases as the source. Can the target be on-prem database in addition to the cloud?
Yes, so that's another good question. So yes, again, I'll point out that we support any of those 150 plus data sources and platforms as sources, and the target can actually be, I say target, but it can actually be targets. So you can actually move data from a consolidated group to multiple targets. You can say, I want some of this data in the cloud. I want a replication of that to go on-premise at the same time as I'm synchronizing. And so we can go ahead and do that. We can go to multiple targets and in a hybrid world, on-premise or in the cloud.
Okay, here's one on data access. Am I correct in assuming that you can read and write to any bases from your Excel client?
Great question. Yes, so I did mention we have an add-on in the Excel world, and we provide data access through our Excel client. And for those that I didn't show a screenshot, so for those that aren't aware, we have a client where we've created a ribbon right within Excel, much like you have a file ribbon and a home ribbon. We created a connects ribbon, and that just gives you double-click access to any of the 150 different data sources we support. And that access is real-time, read and write. So again, for the masses, I would say for 95% of the consumers, they're just going to be reading that data. Having said that, there are probably use cases where some people with the right credentials and the authorizations or the ability to update need to update from a mass update solution like Excel, and that would be the perfect solution. So yes, we can read and write from Excel to any of the 150 plus data sources. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, that Excel ribbon sounds fabulous. Okay, another one for Daniel. You mentioned that no code is important for enabling fast data movement. So in practice, what sort of no code capabilities should I be looking out for?
Okay, so this obviously is part of a self-service story. The most important capability no code can have in this context is to enable that self-service, meaning it needs to be easy enough for your business users to get to grips with it and use it efficiently. So that usually means some sort of drag and drop oriented visual editor, which I think I mentioned before. But it's also, often the sort of things you want to look at are how deeply you can dive into it. So for example, if a technical user does want to start augmenting, the no-code solution with actual coding, is that possible? How robust that capability is. There's also, it can also be worth thinking about sort of integration capabilities. Often these solutions have ways for developers to create sort of custom components using their own code and then publish them to all of their users. If you've got a sort of flowchart model, but yeah, there's a lot of different capabilities to look at. Most important is finding something which suits your business users and it's going to be easy for them to use.
Got it. Okay. Seeing no more questions, let me just take one last look if one just popped in there. Seeing no more questions, great session. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I also want to thank Daniel and Harpal for sharing their expertise with us today. Later this week, watch for a follow-up email. It will contain a link to the recording of today's webinar. And in that on-demand webinar, this functionality is also available. So if you didn't get a chance to download some of these assets, please revisit the on-demand webinar. And that concludes our webinar. Thanks again. Have a great day. Bye now.